What's happening, guys? Today we're going to be learning how I created my image called Dreamer way back at the beginning of 2017. It's probably one of my most requested tutorials, and now I'm finally putting it together to start the year off right. So let's get started. What's happening, guys? My name's Brendan from BeWheelCreative.com, home to editing tutorials, camera gear reviews, tricks, and tips. If you're not into learning new things or cool websites, then just find me on Instagram at Burnwills to see a little bit more of my work. So today I'm going to be going through how I created this composite way back in the beginning of 2017 called Dreamer. Now, for those of you guys who have been subscribed to me for a long time now, you'll know that I made a speed art tutorial, so kind of like a time lapse of the entire edit way back when I made it, but I never actually made a tutorial on how I created the image in more of like an explained version. So that's what I'm going to do here today. So if you guys are wanting to follow along with this tutorial, you're more than welcome to. I've left a download link down in the description below so you can follow along with all the images and create this image for yourself. So without further ado, let's get started. So here I am in Photoshop, and as you see, I've already gone ahead and I've brought all of my layers into my composition here. So I just have my Milky Way layer, my city layer, my clouds, my mountains, and my balloons, and then over here, of course, is the photo of the girl holding the balloons. So first things first is what I like to do when I'm creating these images is, since I already know that I'm going to be putting the girl sort of up front and center here, and she's just a silhouette, it's not going to take any time to do. So I'm just going to kind of ignore all of that, and I'm just going to try to build the background first. So the first thing that I'm probably going to want to do is I'm going to go into my clouds here, and as you see, there's like this monkey or something sitting on the end of like a building or something, and obviously we don't want that. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to create a new layer. I'm going to clip it to my clouds layer by holding Alt and just clicking between the two layers. Now I'm going to grab my clone stamp tool by pressing S. I'm going to make sure my sample is set to current and below, and now I'm just going to go ahead and I'm just going to hold Alt to sample, and I'm just going to paint out the monkey. So what I find sometimes works in this case is if you just sort of sample a spot directly adjacent to where you're about to paint, and then you can just sort of run it along in like you're mowing a lawn in a sense, you know, just doing it in little grids, and then it makes it a little bit easier. So it's not a big deal if things are looking a little rough at first, because we can go through and touch it up afterwards. Go to about there, and I'm going to make sure I want to use the light side of the clouds where the light side of clouds are, so obviously on the left here. So something like this, maybe mingle them up a little bit. Something like this. So as you see, this is sort of like a harsh line here. So what I want to do is I want to change my opacity up here to 10%. So I'm just going to press 1 on my keyboard, change my opacity to 10%. And now when I sample and paint, it's just going to be painting at 10% of my sample essentially. So there's not really a whole lot being painted on, but it's just enough to sort of blend the two together and soften the edges a little bit more, kind of like this. It's very subtle, but if you just go through a couple times, you see that it ends up blending really nicely, and you can't even tell where the original cutout was. So now that we've taken the monkey out of our photo here, you can see by just turning on and off our clone stamp layer like that, what I'll want to do is now I want to merge these two layers. So I'm going to shift click both of them and press Command or Control E to merge both those layers, and now I'm just going to name this once again to clouds. So just a heads up, there is so much to cover in this tutorial, so I might be going a little bit faster. If you have any questions or didn't quite catch anything, just go back in the video or leave a comment down below, and I can try to help you out the best I can. Alright, so now moving on, we know that we want to have our clouds here, and then we want to have the mountains, Milky Way up top, and then the city down below. So we're obviously not going to want these mountains back here. So I'm going to add a layer mask to my clouds layer, and I'm just going to grab my brush tool, going to resize my brush so it's nice and big, and then I'm going to be painting with black on my layer mask, and I'm just going to mask out those mountains with the soft brush, sort of getting the general idea of it, because then we're going to play around with the sort of the clouds after. So now that we've done this, we can go ahead and we can turn on our mountains layer. We're going to want to put our clouds, of course, in front of our mountains like this. And now I'll grab my move tool for my clouds by pressing V, and I'm just going to rescale my clouds, or reposition my clouds till I sort of find an area that I'm happy with. So I might just throw my clouds like right around here for now, and then I'm going to duplicate them by pressing Command or Control J. And now I'm just going to move those clouds forward, bring them behind. And now as you see, we're sort of like duplicating our clouds here, and you'll just want to play around with them so you don't have like duplicates going on. But something like this looks pretty good to me. I'll just want to make sure that I go back to my top clouds here, which is this layer here. And I'm just going to grab my brush tool and I'm just going to run through here quickly just to sort of get rid of any sort of similarities, I guess. Likewise, if you wanted, like, see how there's these two areas that have the same line, I guess, in the clouds, I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to clone stamp out one of those areas just like this. So now it's just a little bit less obvious that these two clouds are actually exactly the same, extending each other. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to just re-crop my canvas here because this is where I want my clouds to be kind of. So I'm just going to press C to crop my canvas here, and I'm going to just drag up my crop till it fits my image a little better. So we'll have to do a couple things with our mountains here. First thing that I'm going to do before I rescale or anything, I'm just going to cut out my mountains here. Luckily for us, since they're sort of dark against a brighter background here, we can just use our quick selection tool by pressing W, and then we can just click and drag across our selection like that. You see that it makes this little selection here. If we hold Command Shift I, it'll invert that selection, and now when we add that selection to a layer mask, it just keeps our mountains there for us. So now what we're going to do, we got to play around with the perspective a little bit here. So right now you see how small these mountains are and they look really, really far away. So let's try to make them seem a little bit bigger. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to sort of stretch them up taller, I guess, something like this perhaps, and then I'm going to just scale them out as well, just to sort of make them a little bit more beefy. This is sort of personal preference, so if you want your mountains to look really far away, then make them smaller, but if you want them to be a little bigger, then obviously just do what I'm doing here. Now I'm just going to click my checkbox. That looks good to me. And now pretty much our mountains are good to go. So at this point, you can either go ahead and you can work on your city or you can work on your Milky Way, but I'm going to start with our Milky Way just because there's a little bit more work involved with that one. So here's my Milky Way layer. If I just click on my Milky Way layer, rescale it to sort of fit in my sky a little bit better, you see sort of what we're dealing with here. We have a lot more stars and real estate on this side versus this side, so we're going to have to sample this area to throw over on the other side. It might sound a little bit confusing, but bear with me, it's actually not very hard at all. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to reposition and rescale my Milky Way until I'm sort of finding an area that I'm liking. Of course, it's up to you how much you want or how zoomed in you want your Milky Way to be. But in this case, I kind of want my Milky Way about this size. That's looking pretty good to me. And then what I'm going to do is see these mountains down here. I don't want those, of course. So I'm going to grab my clone stamp tool, click on my layer, just click OK if you haven't rasterized your layer. And now I'm just going to sample again, making sure that my clone stamp is set to 100% opacity, and I'm just painting right on the layer. I'm not needing to do anything to exact here. It's just to try to get rid of the mountains the best I can. So now we've gotten rid of our mountains, and what we can do now is we obviously need to fill in a couple of these areas out here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this clone stamp layer on a new layer, and we're not going to clip it onto our Milky Way because we want to be able to fill in these extra areas. So these little corners out here, I'm just going to use my clone stamp tool. Then this area here, I will use my marquee tool, make a duplicate layer, and fill it. Again, if that sounds complicated, don't worry. We're going to run through it right now. So first thing, of course, we're still using our clone stamp tool, opacity set to 100%, and now since we're on a different layer, you have to make sure that your sample is set to current and below, or else this will not work. So I'm just going to sample near the edge of my stars here, and I'm just going to paint out like so. If sort of the exposures and stuff are a little bit wonky, it's not a big deal. We can go ahead and we can fix that a little bit later, but we're just sort of trying to fill in the canvas as best we can right now. So I'm just going to do the same thing over here. Again, sampling and just sort of painting down as I go. Like mowing a lawn, right? You got to do it in grids. And so now that we have this, what I can do is I'm just going to shift click my two layers here. So my clone layer, which is my layer 1 and my Milky Way. I'm just going to press Command or Control E to merge those two layers. And now I'm going to grab my marquee tool and I'm just going to make a selection around this area. Something like this. And now with that selection made, I'm going to press Command or Control J, and so now I have that exact selection but on a new layer here. So what I can do is I'm just going to bring it over this way, but as you see, keep in mind here that this side, the left side of our stars of our new selection here are a little bit brighter than the ones on the right, so we want the brighter stars to be near the Milky Way. So we're just going to press Command T, right click, and then flip horizontal, just like that. So now we're just going to rescale them until they fit within our canvas, like so. And that's looking pretty good there. So now, of course, we'll just have to add a layer mask to that. Grab our brush tool. We're going to be painting black, of course, and then we will just go ahead and we can mask out that harsh edge right there. Perfect. So now we have filled in our entire sky. No problem at all. So now what I can do is I'm just going to shift click the two layers, and I'm just going to press Command and E to merge those two layers once again, and we'll call this Milky Way. So now we have filled in our entire Milky Way here, and if I just turn that on and off, you can see all the adjustments that we made are now on one layer for us, which is super awesome. So next thing in the process of building our image here is we want to add in our city in the clouds here. So a lot of people were asking me questions about this one, and they seemed super confused about it, but believe me, it's actually super easy to do, and let me show you. So what we're going to do is, just to sort of scale it up and things, I'm going to bring it up to the top just so I can see it a little better. I'm going to press Command T, and since this is sort of like a top-down photo, it's actually from NASA, so it's just a top-down photo, and I'm just going to right-click and go to perspective, so then I can make it look as if it's sort of as if the city's sort of going out on a plane. So I'm just going to drag this out like so, and then of course this area down here is going to be the area that we'll be exposing. So we'll place it sort of however you want, I guess, but in this case I'm just going to sort of put it right in this area like that. So next thing is I can now go ahead and just drag it down between my clouds and my mountains here, and then what we'll have to do is we'll add a layer mask to our city here, and we're just going to mask out this little edge of the city that was being exposed. So now it's sitting underneath, and there's no parts sticking out. Next thing is I'm just going to merge my two clouds, because remember there's two layers of the clouds here, and I'm just going to press Command E to merge them, and now I'll add another layer mask to that. And what I'm going to do from here is, since our city is below our clouds, what we want to do is sort of make it look as if the city is just peering through the clouds. So of course we don't want to just paint 100% on and then there's this weird gap here that just doesn't look very good. What we can do instead is if we change our opacity of our brush to 10%, so we can press 1 on our keyboard once again, we can just go ahead and we can just paint over in the areas that we're wanting our city to be exposed in. So if you go over a few more times, it will become a little bit more exposed, but this is sort of a really easy way to make it look as if there's a city lying underneath the clouds, and the clouds still look as if they're actually clouds. There's actually like fog between the city and where your camera is positioned for the photo, hypothetically. So for me, this looks good. You guys can go as crazy or as little as you'd like, but for me, this is sort of where I'm going to leave it. So now that we've sort of put everything together in its general position, we can now do any fine adjustments. So I might want to change around the mountains. I might want to just play around with how they're sitting. So I'm going to just stick them kind of like around here, and then I'm going to have to go to my clouds, and I'm just going to mask out some of the cloud that's sticking up above them, above the peaks there. Next thing that I'm going to do quickly is, since if you look at our clouds here, they're a little bit more warm than the ones in the back, so let's make them a little bit more blue. I'm going to grab my color balance adjustment layer, clip it to my clouds. I'm going to just add a little bit of blue. I'm just sticking in the midtones, add a little bit of blue, and then a little bit of cyan as well. This could take a little bit of finessing, it's kind of up to you, but I'm kind of going for a little bit of a purpley vibe just to sort of stick with what the original image looked like. Next is, this is sort of the color that I'm wanting to have, so I'm going to do the same thing to my mountains. I'm going to click on my mountains layer, grab a color balance adjustment layer, clip it to my mountains, and I'm just going to add a little bit of blue and then a little bit of red, something like this. That looks good to me. So now you might be noticing that there's like sort of some fringing stuff. You may or may not have got that. Doesn't really matter because it's going to sort of blend in when we add in these gradients here. So next thing that we're going to do is we're going to add in some gradients. So these gradients we want to be sitting sort of coming up the horizon here. So of course we're going to be putting those gradients between our Milky Way and our mountains layer. So we're going to create 3 different gradients here. So the first one, I'm just going to create a new layer, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to pick a nice sort of light yellow color, almost white, something like that. So now I'm just going to grab my gradient tool by pressing G, make sure I have a linear gradient selected, and I'm just gonna hold shift to make my gradient straight. I'm just gonna drag up a little bit like that. So now I just have this little gradient coming up there. Now I'll call that one white-ish grad, because not quite white, kind of yellow, but I don't know. And now I'm going to create another layer, and we're going to do the same thing except with some orange. So go ahead and just pick a nice orange color that you like, and we're going to do the same thing. Hold shift, make sure you have your gradient tool selected, hold shift, and then I'm just going to go a little bit longer this time, like that. So that looks cool there. I'm going to create one more layer, and I'm going to make this one sort of a nice pinkish color, pinkish light purple. This perhaps, there we go. And I'm just going to do it one more time, except quite a bit longer, so like up to here-ish. And then now we have this nice big grad here. So you might want to layer, like sort of switch the layering here. So instead of having the white at the bottom, just switch it around so the white's at the top, then you have orange and then pink. So now that you see we sort of added this nice grad behind our mountains here that sort of transition up into our stars, and that's sort of the look that we're going for. Now this might be a little bit intense, so what we're going to do is we're just going to go through individually, and we're going to adjust the color values of all of them, or the opacity values of all of them. So what I'm going to do is I'm first going to go to my white-ish grad, and I'm going to go to my fill. I'm just going to bring down my fill. I usually start at 0, and then I just work my way up until I find a place I'm happy. So 59% looks good there. And now I'm going to do the same thing with my orange, bring my fill down to 0, work my way up till I find something I'm happy with. Like that looks nice. And then lastly, my pink grad, I'm just going to bring to 0 and then work my way up. So that looks good to me there. And now we'll group all of these layers. So just shift click all of them, press Command or Control G to group them. And then we'll just name this to Grads Horizon. So now that we've placed in our grads and things like that, our image is sort of becoming built. But while you're doing this, you might see things that you're not really into. So in this case, the Milky Way, I don't really like the size and positioning of it. So I'm just going to rescale it a little bit and just bring it over like that. I kind of like that a little bit more. This is all personal preference though, so it's totally up to you. So now let's start adding in some interesting effects, I guess, some lighting effects. So of course we have the light coming in on the clouds from our left side, so that will encourage us to put sort of a light source over on the left side on the horizon there. So what I'm going to do is above pretty much everything here is I'm just going to create a new layer, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pick a nice sort of reddish color, or almost a reddy orange. And now I'm just going to create a nice big and soft brush. Just click once like this. Now I'm going to go a little bit lighter, perhaps with an orange color like that. And I'm just going to bring my brush size down, click one more time, and then go pretty much almost all the way to white here. Go down even more and click one more time. So now we have this sort of little orb on a new layer that we can do whatever we want with. So what we're going to do is we're going to change our blending mode from normal down to linear dodge add. And now we can just bring it in over to where we're wanting, and then we can just play around with the fill here. So I'm just going to bring down my fill. I just usually go to 0%, and then I'll just work my way back up like this till I find sort of a nice glow that I like. So for now, let's stick about here. I'm just going to hold Alt and then just going to drag out the outside like this. So now we're getting like this nice glow across our horizon here. So I might bring it up a little more. Now next thing, to go along with our sunburst, we're going to add out sort of like this light beam kind of thing on our clouds. So we're going to go and grab our polygonal lasso tool by clicking right here on our polygonal lasso tool. If you don't see it, just hold and click, go to polygonal lasso tool. Now we're just going to put our first anchor point down here where sort of our light is coming from. We're going to stretch it out to where we want our beam to go to. We're going to sort of fit it into the plane of our sky or our clouds here, and we're going to finish that. Makes a selection for us. Now if we just click on our curves adjustment layer, it loads that selection onto a layer mask for us. So now when we make any adjustments in this curves, it only affects that area. So we're just creating like a light beam or light ray, whatever you want to call it, that is coming across our clouds here. So you can go as crazy with this as you'd like, but I'm just going to go somewhere about here. And then since it's like a sort of reddish pink, I'm going to be adding in a little bit of yellow. And then I'm going to also add in a little bit of red like this. So now what we want to do is we want to add a blur to this so there's not these harsh lines. So we can go up here to filter, blur, and Gaussian blur. And so you can just play around with the feather of your blur, but I just want this to be almost sort of hardly noticeable like this. Like this is sort of the look I'm going for. So that looks good right about there. If you're wanting, because this is a layer mask, you can just go ahead and you can paint any of those extra adjustments out here. So for example, I kind of want this area to be a little bit brighter. So if I just click on my layer mask, I can paint with white onto that layer mask, and you can see it just applies those same effects right over onto the clouds here. Now that we've pretty much dealt with our clouds and things like that, now we can go and we can start dealing with our Milky Way a little bit more. How I like to edit my Milky Ways is I like to have my Milky Way, sort of like the galaxy part, a little bit more sort of bright and colorful, where the rest is a little bit less interesting. At least that's how I like to go about it. So what I'm going to do first is I'm just going to go and I'm going to grab my curves adjustment layer, clip it to my Milky Way. I'm going to bring up my highlights here like so. And then I might just bring down my shadows just the slightest bit, but I kind of want to brighten the entire Milky Way part here, just for the style of like this photo. So now that's looking pretty good there. And what I might want to do is I might want to just go and try to fix this little dark area here. So again, if I just sample nearby and paint it out like this, so now it's just not so, it's not so harsh, I guess. So now let's try to play around with the colors of our Milky Way a little bit. So you can do this in a couple different ways. I'm going to try our hue saturation adjustment layer first. So of course, most of our color is going to be in our blues tab here. So I'm going to go to my blues. You can double check just by bringing up your saturation, then it will show you everything that's being affected. And so I'm just going to play around my hue until I kind of want to make it a little bit more of a purpley color like that. Even though it's only +4 on our hue slider, it does make a very obvious difference. Next thing that I want to do is I want to sort of brighten just the Milky Way part. So I'm just going to grab my brightness and contrast adjustment layer. I'm going to bring up my brightness just a bit like this. And now, because I don't want to affect the other areas, I'll press Command or Control I on my brightness and contrast layer. And now I'm just going to go and grab my brush tool and paint white onto my Milky Way here. So now we'll just be brightening the area around our Milky Way. Currently, I think this is sort of where I'm wanting it to be at. So now I'm just going to go to my mountains and I want to try to brighten them up a little bit more, maybe add a little bit more to their highlights or something. So I'm going to grab my curves adjustment layer, make sure it's clipped to my mountains, and I'm going to bring up the levels just a bit like this. Maybe add in some contrast there. So remember, you're also going to be affecting the clouds because there are some clouds that go along with these mountains. So you just got to be aware of that when you're sort of adding in contrast, because you don't want to go too crazy and then all of a sudden those clouds look a little bit darker in the back. So yeah, just keep in mind. So now as you see, we've pretty much created the background for our image. So now we can start thinking about bringing in our subject, which is this girl on a rock. So for those of you guys who have been with me for a while now, you might have already seen my tutorial on the 3 best ways to cut out images in Photoshop. If you're wanting to see that, you can go ahead and click the link down in the description below. But basically what we're going to be doing is we're just going to be cutting out our image with channels here. I'm not going to be explaining it a whole bunch. If you want to learn about channels and a bunch of other cool ways to cut things out in Photoshop, then go ahead and watch that video. So I'm just going to go to my channels tab here. I'm going to go and find the one that has the most contrast. My blue has the most contrast, so I'm going to duplicate that channel, and I'm going to press Command or Control L to bring up my levels, and I want to pretty much make the background white and her black, so then we can make a nice selection. So I'm just going to bring up this slider to basically make these highlights become very white, and then we're going to do the opposite, and we're going to make sure that she and the rock becomes black. So that looks good to me, and I'm just going to click OK. So as you see, there is a little bit of gray and things like that. It's not a big issue. We can just mask that out after. So now we'll hold Command or Control. We're going to click on our blue copy thumbnail here, go back to our layers, click on our layer mask icon. We'll press Command or Control I to invert that selection. And now what we can do is we can just go ahead with a black brush, and we're just going to pretty much mask out all the areas that we don't want. So in this case, since we're going to be going around the rock and stuff, make sure you use a hard brush when you're doing this, so then you can be a little bit more accurate with what you're affecting. In this case, the nice thing is that since it's a rock, rocks are pretty random, so you can just go ahead and sort of just do a rough outline of the rock, and then you can go ahead after and add in the imperfections. It's kind of difficult to see here, so what you can do if you're not sure if you've got everything, you can hold Alt and click on your layer mask, and now if you zoom in, this is exactly what your layer mask is looking like. And so of course everything that's white is visible while everything that is black is transparent. So we just wanted to make sure that there's nothing outside of our rock and things like that. So I'm just going to take this moment just to sort of redo the outside of my rock here, just because it has these gross like little brush lines. So I'm just going to use a smaller brush, change my opacity, change my hardness to about 90%, and I'm just going to go through and kind of smooth out some of this rock. But like I was saying, rocks are random, so little imperfections are okay, and that's the nice thing about this. We can just go through and do all of this by hand. Awesome, so now I'll just press Command 0 to zoom back out, hold Alt and clicking on my layer mask. So now I know everything is looking perfect and we're ready to bring it into our other image. So I'm just going to grab my move tool by pressing V, drag and drop it into my other composition here, just like this. And of course we want to make sure that it's sitting at the top of everything, like that. And now we can just rescale it and position wherever we please. So in this case, I'm just going to scale her up a little bit, and I'm going to kind of put her right sort of in this little nook of the mountains like that. So that looks great there. And now, of course, we have our balloons here, and we'll throw those balloons in as well. So I'm just going to grab my balloons, and I'm going to just move and rescale them so they fit a little bit better with her. Sort of make it match up with her hand. And that looks pretty good right there. Now, one thing you might notice is if I zoom in, she's a little bit blurry just because when I shot this, I had to use a bit of a slow shutter speed because I kind of shot it last minute when the sun was pretty much gone. So because she's a little bit blurry, that's okay. But what we'll have to do is we'll have to go ahead and we'll blur the balloons as well. Since our balloons are already a smart object, we can just go ahead and go to Filter, Blur, and Gaussian Blur. And now we're just going to add a really subtle blur just so it sort of matches up with her a little bit better. There we go. So that looks good there. You might be thinking that's a little bit weird, but if you've ever actually shot a photo of stars and you've tried to put a person in them, more often than not, you'll at least have a blur about this much. So in a way, it's almost making it a little bit more photorealistic. Alright, so now we've pretty much built our photo, everything's looking pretty great, and so what we'll have to do now is let's just do a couple little housekeeping things. So I'm just going to rename this to Girl, and I'm going to group the two, her and the balloons, I'm going to group those, so I'm just going to press Command G to group. Now I'm just going to rename this to Girls, or Girl, sorry. And now you can sort of take a look at our project and what we have going on here. So now everything is in place, everything's where we want it to be. And now what we can do is our general and overall adjustments to our image. So now those adjustments are going to sit above everything else. First of all, I'm going to start with my curves just because I want to make this a little bit brighter. So I'm just going to drag up my highlights like this, and then I'll just bring down my shadows just a little bit, just to add a touch of contrast. If I turn that on and off, you can see we've brightened the image, but we've also added a little bit of contrast as well. Perfect. Next is I want to add a little bit of gradient down behind our rock here. So I'm just going to go and create a new layer underneath my girl group here. And I'm just going to first add some ND. So I'm just going to grab my gradient tool, click on my gradient editor, click on this one here, which is a gradient or a neutral density gradient. And I'm just going to hold shift and I'm just going to click and drag up like that, just to kind of darken down below here. And I'll just play around the fill a little bit just to soften it up a bit better. That's great. So I'm just going to call that one ND. Now I'm going to create another layer, and I want to add sort of a little bit of a warmer color. I can sample a color from the horizon if I'd like, so I'm just holding Alt and clicking an area. Now it samples that color for me. I might bring it up a little bit to make it a bit warmer. I'm going to once again grab my gradient tool, make sure I pick my foreground to transparent gradient, click OK. And now I'm just going to click and drag up like that. Then I'm just going to change my blending mode from normal down here to overlay. And then once again, I'm going to bring my fill to 0 and work my way back up until I find a nice little area here. So this is nice and subtle here, but it's just a little bit of color for down below. And I'm going to just call this one Orange Overlay. So the next thing that we want to do is to just add a little bit more focus onto our Milky Way, and to her, we want to darken around the edges of our image here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my dodge and burn tool, but for any of you who are familiar with Photoshop or the dodge and burn tool, you'll know that you can't use the dodge and burn tool on anything unless it's like an actual layer. So if I wanted to apply dodge and burn to my clouds, for example, I'd have to actually paint onto my clouds, which I don't want to do because I don't want to have anything that's permanent. So here's a really awesome workaround that a lot of you may or may not know already. So if you hold Command Shift and N or Control Shift and N, you'll get this new layer tab that comes up. Just call it DB for dodge and burn, and we're going to change our blending mode from normal down to overlay, and then we'll check the fill with overlay neutral color 50% gray. Click OK. So now it gives us a layer that's 50% gray, or is filled with 50% gray, but it's completely invisible on our project here because our blending mode is set to overlay. But here's the cool part about it. Now if I go ahead and I'm just using my burn tool here, I can go and I can start to darken areas of my image, but it's getting painted on to my 50% gray layer. So we're not actually permanently affecting anything, but we're still able to use our dodge and burn tools. So this is kind of up to you how far you want to take it, but I'm just going to kind of darken around the edges, and then we'll add a little bit more accenting from the light and stuff in a moment. So now I've sort of done the burning around the edges that I've wanting to accomplish, I guess. And so now I'm going to go and grab my dodge tool, and we can just go and lighten up some of the sunlight here, maybe some of the clouds along the horizon. And then of course I'm going to lighten up the Milky Way just a little as well. So if I just turn that on and off, you can see the difference that has made and how much more style that is added into our image just by using our dodge and burn tool. So that's pretty much it, guys. We've just combined 6 different images to create this really awesome silhouetted composite sort of standing up above the city, Milky Way above our heads, and it looks super awesome, magical, sort of fantasy-like, what have you. If you followed along with this, I would love to see what your images turned out like, especially if you had any cool creative twists on them. So make sure to tag me on Instagram @burnwills if you decide to upload those photos to Instagram. If you're not much of an Instagram person, then make sure to visit my website at bewillcreative.com for tons of awesome free lessons and tutorials all about Photoshop and improving your photography. Anyways, guys, my name is Brendan, and that's all I have for you for today. I hope to see you back here next time for another new Photoshop tutorial. See you then.